Welcome to Barely Prepping. Today, we're going to start out by talking about how to prep or how to embrace preparedness in the barely bullish way, which is really just whatever crackpot ideas come out of my head. But the first one I want to talk about is antibiotics and medication storage. Now, I'll preface this with a couple of warnings and disclaimers. The first thing I want to say is certainly if you have known medications that you're on and you're taking, obviously those take priority. I'm assuming that you don't take any of those medications, or these are whatever I'm talking about that I hold on to. Those are things that I'm holding on to. I'm not assuming those are good for your situation. Different people out there have different morbidities that would be and contraindications to these medications as well. So obviously keep continuing taking your medications. That's plan number one. But these are specific things that as a generally healthy individual, I'm looking at and saying, okay, these are things that I'd like to have on board in case something happens, right?
Yes.
The second disclaimer is we're going to talk about holding these and storing them long term. Now, technically, if any medication or drug has an expiration date, it's only good up until that expiration date. And thereafter, typically most drugs simply lose their potency. You can talk more about this perhaps than I can. And also, they not only lose their potency, but every once in a while, depending on formulations and other factors and storage factors and everything else, they can actually, some of the drug metabolites, or not metabolites, some of the drug compounds can actually cause toxicity, if not stored correctly or if allowed to expire. So technically, the expiration date is the expiration date, and I would never recommend under ordinary circumstances that anyone try using medication past an expiration date. Okay? Today, let's talk about storage for antibiotics. Let's talk about what to get for antibiotics and also how to get them. Recently, we've had a shortage of a couple of antibiotics, and you have some experience with this. Sounds like you have some knowledge of this.
Yeah, well, my background is in the pharmaceutical industry, so I do have some, at least anecdotal experience. I think at least regionally here in the Midwest, there's been a lot of shortages of Amoxicillin and azithromycin, especially the reconstituted formulations. So a lot of children's antibiotics. The same with a lot of cephalosporins, which is just another very commonly prescribed antibiotic.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the shortages have been in the liquid formulations, like I said, but that has also caused a bit of a shortage sometimes for the oral capsules. So it's actually been pretty handy that we've had our own supply here, although I think that is really uncommon to happen. It's been going on up here at least for maybe 2 or 3 weeks now.
Yeah. And with supply chain disruptions, with reliance on a lot of drug manufacture from China and also from India, if there's any sort of slowdowns or breakdowns in global trade, it might be difficult to access some drugs, at least for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the intervening time, it makes sense to have them. And before we get too much into it, I do want to talk a little bit about the morality of hoarding or storing medications. I'll say this much, or for that matter, hoarding or storing food or any other preparatory items. I stumbled across a couple of articles written by physicians, and they specifically recommended not hoarding, quote-unquote, hoarding drugs. Maybe in an acute emergency that might be the case. For example, if you believe there might be an imminent decline in availability of certain drugs, to run out to the store and buy 50 cases of them. Okay,
Right.
I can see how that's somewhat counterproductive. But to buy them ahead of time and store them, as more and more people do that, what that does is that drives demand up, which all the things being equal drives price up, right? And in the face of a constant supply, and that elevation of price, that movement of product sends inventory volume signals and sends price signals to distributors, wholesalers, and then ultimately to manufacturers to let them know to make more product. So the free market will produce more medications, and the best way, and foods and whatever else, but the best way to have there not be major price volatilities and shocks and shortages, well, there will never be shortages as long as there aren't any price caps, not in totally free market. But anyway, the best way to avoid there being rapid price fluctuations in general is for people to specifically store a small surplus of what they think they're going to need ahead of time, whatever that thing may be. But here we're talking today about antibiotics.
Right. I mean, we're holding here, each prescription that we have is just basically enough for probably one treatment of an infection, one course of antibiotics.
I think we have a couple of duplicates on the more important ones, but yeah,
Perhaps.
we have 1 or 2 courses. So I'll defer to you on this. You'd probably know a little bit more about how to store some of this stuff. I guess I would start off just thinking about it from the layman perspective. I would just do whatever the package insert said, within a certain temperature variation, certain basically a cool, dry place would be what I'd think for most things.
I mean, typically you would recommend to follow the manufacturer's guidelines for most
Sure.
medications. That's just store in a cool, dark, dry place.
And I guess with things like insulin, the inserts would tell you to store it in a refrigerator at certain temperatures and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. I got a recommendation from a pharmacist I have in the family to get compact tablets and freeze them. And specifically to avoid gel caps, because gel caps can burst if they're frozen. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's a little bit out of my scope from my training, but it seems to follow rationally that you could freeze them. In fact, that's what we've been doing with ours.
Yeah, I mean, I feel good about it. I hope that doesn't bite me. There's some things I know you can't freeze, but I looked up all the things that I have here. I looked up the storage profiles and got all the information I could. It appears safe to freeze them. Anyway, which could enhance the life by several years, potentially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is not first-line medication. This is not something I'm going to go to unless I absolutely have to. This is, I'm very, very sick. I need antibiotics. I can't find them anywhere, including hospitals, right?
Mm-hmm.
SHTF, true SHTF. Not, I don't feel like going to the doctors today. Let me take this 5-year-old, whatever, 5-year-old amoxicillin. Okay, and then what to get. So I've got a small formulary here. Antibiotics are really the focus. So I've got a couple of things I'll talk about too. I've got metronidazole and doxycycline. They both cover a lot of parasites. Metronidazole especially will cover Giardia, which is a pretty rough intestinal bug. And I like to have that around. Doxycycline, and that'll treat everything from malaria to lots and lots of other parasites. And a lot of bacteria too. A lot of the sort of odd bacteria, it'll treat those. Let's see. Why did I get Bactrim again, which is sulfamethoxazole and trimethoprim?
That's just a wide spectrum antibiotic.
Wide spectrum.
So, good for a lot of common infections. I don't want to get the one that's coming to mind. Don't.
No, I got you. UTIs and a bunch of other stuff. Yeah. It's pretty wide spectrum. It'll cover a lot of stuff. We have ciprofloxacin too, and sulfamethoxazole.
That's Bactrim.
Yeah, no, but sulfamethoxazole is it covers a lot of gram-negatives, doesn't it? Decent number of gram-negative bacteria. The gram-positives, we have amoxicillin, clavulanate.
Well, yeah,
right?
that's gram-positive, of course.
We probably should have a cephalosporin, which I notice we don't have here.
I thought we did.
I should add that to the formulary. And then ciprofloxacin, again, that also covers a handful of stuff. But I sat down and I looked at this one day, and I did a long chart of all the bacteria classes that I wanted to make sure to hit, and all the parasite classes, and I made sure there'd be reasonable susceptibility to all these classes, so I can use most of that stuff.
We can even put a list up. It might be helpful for people that are not as familiar with medications.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll write down a list, and at least of what I have sitting around here, and we'll also talk about a couple of lists that other people have come up with too, and my take on them. We'll get to that in the next segment. Before I continue with that, a couple non-antibiotics I have. I got a methylprednisolone taper pack, which I like. Taper packs of steroids are fantastic if you're feeling absolutely horrible from illness, but you have to get back on your feet for a matter of days. Taper packs are great. And then I got a Dancitron too, in case there's excessive nausea, but I don't think I'm going to need to use that. What I like even more that I have is EpiPen. If you have 3 EpiPens sitting around, you can do, if you know how to do ACLS, you can do that, at least a little bit. I wish what I'd like to have is a whole ACLS kit with lidocaine. Oh, sorry. ACLS is Advanced Cardiac Life Support. So it's a protocol for helping bringing people back to life if their heart is stopped. There's BLS, which includes mostly CPR, but ACLS is great because you can throw some drugs at it, and you can use some cardioversion machines, which I don't have, and defibrillators, which I don't have. And I probably should. I should probably get a defibrillator. But I wish I had some more of those drugs sitting around. They're a little hard to come by. I have to get them under special circumstances, and they're difficult to store too. But I could probably get those. I also didn't want to cover this too much in case in this video too, because nobody's going to be able to get those.
Right, it's a little harder to get.
If I can't get them, most people won't be able to either. But a couple of EpiPens, if somebody's heart is stopped, and again, SHTF, if somebody's heart is stopped, you do CPR and you call 911. Unless you have special training, healthcare responder, then that's a different thing. But if the heart is stopped, you can't call 911, you're in an SHTF situation, you've been pumping for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever, and nothing's going on. If you're a healthcare provider and you've done the training, if you can use a couple EpiPens, maybe. What I also have too is an ambu bag, which is a type of, it's an artificial respirator. It can help with CPR, and if you know how to use it, you can keep people going on an ambu bag for 12, 24 hours. You eventually have to get their heart started again, but if they can't breathe for whatever reason, you can keep people on breathing on ambu bags almost indefinitely. In fact, back during the early days of anesthesiology, they would just be pumping ambu bags all day. We didn't have the mechanical respirators that we have now back then, and so anesthesiologists would always run around with Popeye arms because they're pumping ambu bags for hours and hours. So those are great to have too. Two things on this formulary that I want to have in addition to that cephalosporin. I'd like to have albendazole, which is great for parasites. And I didn't get that yet, and I want to have at least one antifungal, probably fluconazole.
Yeah.
To cover a lot of the fungi.
Yeah, I realize we don't have any antifungals.
Yeah, I could use those things too. So I got to add to the formulary. But if you have these drugs, you can cover just about anything. And one specific point I want to make is a lot of people say, okay, antibiotics, people understand intuitively they have a reason to need them, but why are you talking about parasites here, or fungi, or albendazole for helminthic parasites? Well, because if there's an SHTF situation, not a lot of people think about this. A lot of diseases that have plagued mankind for centuries, Americans and most people in Western civilizations haven't seen for decades, if not even centuries, or at least not for a very long time, I guess decades, because public health programs and public sanitation have eradicated most of those. E. coli, cholera, these are the types of bacteria that when there's back sewage, when there's infiltration of water systems by sewage, they run rampant. Right, and so you need to treat these things. Those are bacterial. Helminths, the same way, they can get out. Malaria, when there's standing water because sewage isn't being pumped away and mosquitoes are breeding in it, especially if you're anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, malaria could come back to the United States. That could be a real risk, right? As well as some of the more unusual bacteria that you only get when you have a public health crisis and loss of public sanitation. And you can have that situation happen pretty easily. Standing water and infiltration of sewage into water lines can happen if you have a lack of electricity, a lack of basic infrastructure. If water isn't moving, it's stagnating. And if it's stagnating, it's contaminating your local environment, usually with coliform bacteria and other parasites, or it's standing around and it's accumulating mosquitoes, which spread a whole hell of a lot of diseases. Right? So all these diseases that maybe you don't see a lot of ordinarily, or you don't see a lot today, they're going to break out in an SHTF situation. So having some antiparasitics and some antihelminthics makes a lot of sense.
And aside from the water contamination risks of parasites, there's also if SHTF, you may not be able to get to your pharmacy because they'll either have shortages or they may not be open. And even if you just have something as common as just like a UTI, that's really uncomfortable if you can't get that treated. And, not having the ability to get the treatment that you need for something that's really common and ubiquitous even today could be, really unpleasant.
Yeah. And there are some other things. I got a couple of med kits. If you guys are interested, I can actually do a couple of videos on things I have in med kits that I think are important, and maybe talk about ambu bags some more and other stuff, because I have some more stuff sitting around, but I really wanted to focus this mostly on medications and especially antibiotics. So the last thing I want to talk about is how to get this stuff. I can just write scripts, so I don't have to worry about it. But for a lot of people, it can be difficult. And there are a couple ways to get it. One is if you don't mind traveling and you're not doing this with controlled substances or anything illegal, I'm not advocating breaking the law, but if you happen to be going on vacation in a foreign country, plenty of foreign countries have a lot of over-the-counter medications, including a lot of antibiotics. They're not as regulated as the United States, and they're usually pretty cheap. So if you're looking to get a whole lot of medications to stock up on, and you have the wherewithal to go to Mexico or go to the Caribbean, go on a cruise, you can pick up some of these medications at a pretty good price. If you happen to be traveling anyway, that might be a good way to stockpile. There are, I think, ways of ordering them internationally. I don't know the details of that. I don't know how legal it is. I think it's possible. I'm not advocating it. I'm just pointing out that at least it appears to be an option. Other things could be, what else? Oh yeah, well you can talk to your primary physician about it. You say, okay, I'm a little worried that things might be problematic. Would it be possible for me to get an extra supply just to stockpile? That gets to be a little tricky because then the way you have to write scripts, why don't you tell me this? Like, if you're trying to advise a physician, like how can I help this person stockpile an extra 6 months of medication? Like what could they possibly do?
I think it'd be easy, probably. I mean, again, it would be up to the prescriber's level of comfort, but I think that if it's like just a course of antibiotics, that would be fairly easy to prescribe.
Mm-hmm.
I think where you might get into trouble is if you're trying to get like a year's worth of diabetes medication or something like that in addition to your own supply, because especially with insurance, it would probably be considered fraudulent to write the prescription to double the dosage. And I don't think a lot of prescribers would be comfortable with putting on a prescription bottle instructions that would be twice what you should be taking.
Right. Plus there could be a liability.
Right,
there.
of course.
Yeah.
So I doubt that anyone would be willing to like double the quantity just so that person can stock up over the course of a year. And again, another reason that I think a lot of prescribers might have some hesitation is that if you do get these, they're only good for, a few months or maybe a few years, depending on the expiration date of the dispensed drug. So, the idea that you're going to tell your prescriber, hey, I'm going to put these in the freezer. I mean, I think, we are comfortable with that, but there's not a whole lot of evidence that supports doing that, especially, again, a liability perspective.
Yeah, well.
If that makes sense. So I think you might have some level of resistance. Just no one wants to see anyone get hurt or have, liability.
Liability concerns is what it mostly comes down to. There are a couple of things. I know that if you are traveling to certain parts of the world that have malaria, especially Central America, and you have a general physician and you tell them you're planning to travel there, they'll write you a prophylactic course of a couple of antibiotics, including Doxycycline. And the idea behind that is it's an antimalarial drug, and if you take it ahead of the trip, then you're protected against malaria. Mm-hmm. At least mostly so. There's a couple of them that I think are resistant now. But you can always talk to your physician about that and maybe even plan to go on that trip, and then potentially you forget to go on that trip. I don't know. Another thing they'll often write is for traveler's diarrhea. I think you can use Bactrim for that, which is E. coli. For traveler's diarrhea, which is common in Mexico and in Central America as well.
Yeah, I think traveler's diarrhea is oftentimes actually the doxycycline as well.
Is it? No, I've heard they'll write for
or maybe it's azithromycin. Stuff. Yeah,
azithromycin?
I just can't remember honestly. But yeah, Bactrim definitely does cover E. coli.
Okay.
Absolutely. So yeah, I guess that would be traveler's
diarrhea.
So if you're
traveling, basically if you're traveling to Central America, you can get a couple of these. Now, cost varies everywhere, and pharmacy pricing is really hard. I've seen, stuff like this might cost anywhere from as little as $100 altogether to maybe $500, depending on insurance and which pharmacy you're talking about. I know that grocery stores like Publix in the Southeast, and I think Walmart in some areas, they'll either give this stuff away for free or for cheap. With some programs, you don't even have to do paperwork. They just have a formulary. You can look this up online, a formulary of things that they're giving away at certain prices.
Right.
And I think the idea there is to just help make sure people have a certain access to drugs. I think it's a positive PR campaign type of thing.
Of course, yeah. I think it's to get people using
and to get them
pharmacy.
And to get them in the store too. So there's ways to get this stuff for kind of cheap. What I also came across while I was doing some additional research for this, or while I was kind of poking around, it was there's a couple of outfits that will actually prescribe this stuff through telemedicine visits, right? So one such is Jace Medical. Now, disclaimer, I've got a promotional arrangement with Jace Medical. I'll just throw that out there. So if you buy their stuff, they'll I guess I'll get money at some point, maybe. I have no idea. But at the end of the day, and there are probably cheaper ways to do it. If you're willing to put a little time and effort and do some research, make some calls, go to a couple doctor's visits, especially if you have low copays for doctor's visits or no copays, that can make a lot of sense to you. You can probably, if you're willing to put time and effort and have a little bit of luck, you can probably get all this stuff for maybe as low as $75, $100, maybe even less. It'd be tough, but you could probably do it, and it would take a little bit of time. All right. Jace Medical, they had a deal going. I think it was for $300 or $300.
I thought it was a little more than that, maybe $3 something.
It was $370, $300. I'll put the put the tagline on it.
Yeah.
But anyway, for that amount of medication, I'll show the tagline in the formulary, and I'll probably compare it to mine. But anyway, so they have a formulary, and when I sat down to look at this, like I said, I drew out a table. I figured, okay, what's going to give me coverage for just about anything I might run into? Well, I looked at their formulary, and I think they have everything I had, but I think they had a cephalosporin. I think was the only difference. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they had the ciprofloxacin. So Jace Medical, I looked over their organization. I think they're doing a lot of things the right way. They have you do submit proof that you've had a doctor's visit recently, which is good medicine practice. They also have a very reasonable formulary, and it's there for a reasonable price. I think it is. I think it's reasonable. Could you get cheaper under some circumstances? I think you could, but I think it'll take some work.
Right. It might be a little bit tricky to get just anyone to prescribe these things.
Yeah. And some doctors, they don't want to hear it. Other doctors, they're happy to help you out with it. So, that'll also depend on your relationship with your physician.
Sure.
Although I'll say, generally speaking, if you come to a physician and say, hey, listen, I'm having a real concern that might not be able to get meds, and they're not willing to help you, you might consider looking for another physician at that point, because that is a real concern that I think a lot of people have, and medical personnel should be helping out with that. One little note I want to make too is people have talked about using veterinary antibiotics. That's something that if you know what you're doing, like you're a pharmacist especially, you might be able to pull that off, or if you're a chemist. Some physicians can probably do it. The problem is there are some things in veterinary medicines that aren't exactly safe for humans. Okay, and the dosages are have to be recalculated. You can't give it. Now, I'm not saying that in emergent cases don't consider that at all. I'm just saying if you have the ability to stock up on human antibiotics now, you should probably do that.
Yeah. And
not try to play games with getting fish antibiotics or any of this other stuff. I see this stuff online. I get the logic behind it. I understand that. It's probably not worth your trouble. All right. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave you with that. Try not to screw with that if you don't have to. So we hope you're able to get your hands on a good number of antibiotics if you need those for preparedness kits, so that if there's an SHTF situation, you're going to be okay. At least you have one course, maybe even two courses to help treat yourself or your family if anybody gets sick. I think it's a great idea. And I'll leave you with this. Barely prep so you don't get strep.